Chapter 22, New Business. At 9:20 on Thursday night, Greg sat next to his dad and mom near the back of the meeting room in the municipal building. He sat up extra straight once in a while, trying to see the small group of principals, because Mr. Z had said they would be here. And in the second or third row, down near the front, he was pretty sure he'd spotted the back of Mrs. Davenport's head. Greg squirmed in the folding chair, twisting his neck from side to side. He couldn't get comfortable. He had on a blue sport coat, a pair of itchy gray pants, a white shirt, his best black shoes, and a red necktie borrowed from his brother Ross. Dressing up was Mara's idea. Greg had complained, but she had insisted. "What? Do you want to look like some kid who just came in from the playground?" Mara sat 3 chairs away. She was wearing a dark blue pantsuit and a white shirt with a small ruffle at the neck, her new business outfit, bought especially for the occasion. Then came Mr. and Mrs. Shaw, and at the other end of the row, Mr. Z sat next to Greg. Greg decided that his math teacher was just as twitchy as he was. They had all been sitting, waiting, fidgeting for almost 2 hours. Greg had seen school committee meetings on the local cable TV channel, but he had always flipped right past. And now he knew why. These people talked and talked and talked. Healthcare for teachers, new science books, snow plowing, special education grants, state funding for tests, roof repairs, on and on and on. Greg whispered to Mr. Z, "How much does the town pay the school committee?" Mr. Z held up his right hand with the tips of his thumb and forefinger pressed together. At first, Greg didn't get it. Then he whispered, "0?" Mr. Z nodded. So there it was again. All the people in the world were caring, noble volunteers, except for Greg Kenton, who was selfish and greedy. The note cards Greg held had been rolled, unrolled, bent, chewed on, and twisted until the black ink had turned gray and smudgy. But it didn't matter, because Greg had planned out exactly what he was going to say anyway. And he got to talk first because he had won the coin toss, heads, a victory over Mara. But at the moment, he was wishing he had called tails. As Greg began going over his opening statement for the 9th time, the chairperson of the school committee said, "For the next item under new business, we have a proposal about a comic book club at Ashworth School. Who's speaking on this?" Greg bounced to his feet and managed to say, I am. The chairperson pointed. "Please come up to the table and talk into the microphone." Mara thought Greg looked very nice tonight in his blazer and his gray slacks. His black eye was almost gone, and she was pretty sure he had even tried to brush his hair. As Greg went down the center aisle, he got a good look at Mrs. Davenport sitting in the second row with the other principals. She wasn't smiling. Greg handed a copy of Return of the Hunter and a copy of The Lost Unicorn to each of the 5 committee members. He also gave each of them a book club flyer. Greg sat at the table in front of the microphone. A woman from the local cable channel turned on a video camera, and a small red light began blinking at him. Greg tried to smile into the camera, but his mouth was so dry his lips got stuck on his front teeth. His pounding heart made it feel like he had a squirrel running around under his shirt. The microphone was high, so Greg pulled one leg up under him, cleared his throat, leaned forward, and rattled off his first sentence in a loud, squeaky voice. "I'm Greg Kenton, and I go to Ashworth Intermediate School." Greg gulped and forced himself to talk slower and lower. "I started making little comic books over the summer." He held up the crayon comic. "This was the first one. And in September, I took some copies to school and sold them to my friends, one for $0.25. And everybody liked them. But I didn't know I had to have permission from the school committee to sell things at school. Until Mrs. Davenport told me. So that's what I'm here to ask for. Holding up a copy of The Lost Unicorn, Greg said, Mara Shaw, she lives across the street from me, and she made this comic. I helped her. And now we both want to make more. I call them Chunky Comics, and we think kids will like them, because they're fun to read. Kids could even collect them. Greg held up the book club flyer and noticed that his hand was shaking. Every month at our school, some of the teachers give kids an ad like this, mostly in language arts or reading class. There are all kinds of books in here, and on the back there's an order form. And kids choose what they want, and then they bring money to school, and they buy the books. And kids really like it. So we want to do the same thing. Sell our comic books to kids at school. That was the cue for Mara to stand up. Greg turned stiffly and pointed at her. Mara Shaw will now explain the way our comic book club would work. Greg got up and headed toward a chair on the left side of the room as Mara walked to the front. If Mara was nervous, she didn't show it. From a file folder cradled in one arm, she took a slim stack of stapled pages and handed one packet to each committee member. She walked to the table, sat lightly on the front edge of the chair, spread some papers out in front of her, and said, "Good evening," into the microphone. She nodded and smiled at the camera and then to each of the committee members. Holding up her copy of the packet, she said, "Please look at the first page of the information I handed you. This is a sample order form for the Chunky Comics Club. Right now, there are only 2 titles available, the ones that Greg handed to you. There would be a new order form every month, unless there weren't any new titles. Just like a regular book club, teachers get to choose whether or not they want to be a part of our club. And just like a book club, when kids order comics, teachers get to order copies for free to have in their classrooms." Mara looked up at the committee members. She said, "Please turn to page 2. Greg was impressed with Mara's performance so far. No goof-ups, no shakiness, no drooling, just about perfect. Except she looked like she was 23 years old. And was that makeup on her face? Or was it just the way her cheeks looked when she got excited about something? Because he'd noticed that before. Papers rustled, and Mara said, "Our comic book club also wants to do something different. If we make any money selling our comics at school, we want to donate part of that money to the new book fund of our school library. 10% of all the profits." Mara moved on to page 3. "We know there are other kids at our school who are good at writing and drawing. So we want to have some after-school workshops and maybe help other kids be creative too. And that might mean that there would be more comics and maybe other kinds of books or stories for the Chunky Comics Club." Mara slowly turned the page, lifted up the packet, and made a dramatic pause. Gently waving the sheet back and forth, she said, "This last page is important. Regular book clubs are careful about picking the right kind of books to sell to different aged kids. We're going to be careful too. Everybody knows that some of the comic books at stores are really violent. Chunky Comics won't be like that. Everything sold by our club is going to be approved in advance by teachers. Mr. Xenotopoulos said he would be one of those teachers, and Mrs. Lindahl said she would help too. And now our advisor, Mr. Xenotopoulos, would like to say a few words." Mr. Z made his way to the front of the room, and Mara moved over to sit by Greg. Mr. Z had no handouts. He sat down in front of the microphone and said, "I know it must seem like Greg and Mara are making a strange request. At first, I thought so too. As all of you know, I teach math, and I tend to think that way, mathematically. And the more I've looked at what Greg and Mara are asking, everything adds up. It's completely logical. The book clubs have permission to sell books directly to kids at school. These clubs sell all kinds of books, including ones about cartoon and comic book characters. So Greg and Mara want permission to do the same. They have been creative and responsible, and they found an interesting way to use the skills they have developed at school in reading, writing, art, history, science, and of course, math. As teachers, we try to prepare kids for life after they leave school, for the time when they go out and earn money and become contributing members of the economy and the society. So I think it's great that these kids are doing this right now at their own level in a positive and practical way. And I don't see any conflict at all with the skills and the values our schools are trying to teach. Mr. Z took a deep breath and then said, I know some people don't think comic books are good for children. With your permission, I'd like to use a little math right here. I've been sitting in the back of the room, and I have counted 41 grown-ups at this meeting. So I'm asking for a show of hands, please. How many of us used to read comic books once in a while when we were in elementary or middle school? Greg looked over the audience and quickly counted 29 hands. Among the small cluster of principals, only 2 did not raise their hands, and Mrs. Davenport was one of them. Mr. Z made a note on a small pad of paper. Then he said, Hands down, please. That was 71% of the grown-ups in the room. Now, how many of us read cartoon books when we were children or young teens? Cartoons like Peanuts or Garfield or maybe Disney characters? All but 6 hands went up. Mr. Z made a note, a quick scribble, and said, That's 85% of us. Then Mr. Z said, And how many of us regularly looked at comics or cartoons in newspapers or magazines when we were between the ages of 8 and 12? 100% of the hands in the room went up, even Mrs. Davenport's. Mr. Z turned and smiled at the committee. There's my proof. Apparently, comic books and cartoons do not have the power to keep children from growing up to become responsible citizens like us, the kind of people who run schools and school districts and decide how to spend millions of tax dollars every year. And I believe that the kids at our school will not be harmed by this Chunky Comics Club. If anything, I think they'll be inspired to engage in a lot of constructive ways. So I rest my case. And as Mara said, I'm happy to be one of the teachers who makes sure that every item presented by this club is appropriate. Mr. Z nodded at the committee members, said thank you, then stood up and walked back to his seat. The chairperson put a hand over her microphone and leaned first left and then right to whisper to the other members of the committee. She said, Thank you, Mr. Xenotopoulos, and thank you, Greg and Mara, for your interesting presentation. The committee would like to take some time to consider this request before voting. It's getting late, so if there is no other discussion, we can move on to the last item under new business, the contract with the food service company for the high school. Greg watched the chairperson as she looked out across the room, and Greg saw her eyes stop, saw her face change, saw that she was about to call on someone, because someone wanted more discussion about the Chunky Comics Club. Without even looking, Greg knew who it was, and he was right. It was Mrs. Davenport.